Developing in Seffner, a sinkhole with a deadly history is reopened. It's been 10 years since it killed a man who was asleep in his bed. This is now the third time that sinkhole is opened. Kelly Cowan on what officials are doing to keep people safe.
The morning sun had barely risen over the Gulf Coast when the beach simply vanished. One moment, families were setting up umbrellas on what seemed like solid sand. The next, a section of shoreline the size of 3 football fields collapsed into a churning void, swallowing beach chairs, a lifeguard stand, and nearly claiming a morning jogger who leaped to safety as the ground crumbled beneath her feet. This wasn't an isolated incident in some remote corner of Florida. This was Clearwater Beach, one of the state's most popular tourist destinations. And it was the third major coastal collapse in less than 2 months. What's happening beneath Florida's postcard-perfect beaches isn't just alarming. It's rewriting everything we thought we knew about the stability of America's coastline. Florida has always lived with sinkholes. They're part of the state's identity, like hurricanes and alligators. But something has fundamentally changed. The sinkholes that once appeared occasionally in neighborhoods and highways are now racing toward the ocean. And when they reach the coast, they're creating catastrophic collapses that are swallowing entire sections of beach. Scientists are calling it a perfect geological storm, the convergence of ancient vulnerabilities and modern pressures that's literally causing Florida's foundation to cave in from below. To understand what's happening, you need to grasp a startling truth about Florida's geography. Unlike most states built on solid bedrock, Florida sits on a massive platform of limestone, a porous rock that resembles a gigantic stone sponge riddled with cavities, channels, and underground rivers. This limestone foundation was formed over millions of years from the compressed remains of ancient sea creatures, their calcium-rich shells creating layer upon layer of sedimentary rock. It's beautiful geology, but it's also fundamentally unstable. Water flows through this limestone constantly, slowly dissolving the rock and creating vast underground networks of caves and voids. Over thousands of years, these voids grow larger and larger until the ground above them can no longer support its own weight. Then it collapses. The Floridan Aquifer, one of the world's most productive sources of fresh water, exists within this limestone platform. It's a vast underground reservoir that supplies drinking water to millions and has made Florida's explosive population growth possible. But every gallon of water pumped from this aquifer removes support from the ground above. Imagine a sponge saturated with water, providing structure and support to everything resting on it. Now imagine draining that sponge while buildings, roads, and entire cities continue to press down from above. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. For decades, sinkholes in Florida were primarily an inland phenomenon. The famous Winter Park sinkhole of 1981 swallowed a house, part of a Porsche dealership, and a municipal swimming pool, creating a crater 300 feet wide and 90 feet deep in the heart of a residential neighborhood. The Bayshore Boulevard collapse in Tampa, the Lando Lakes disaster, the endless smaller sinkholes that appear in suburban lawns and shopping center parking lots. These were alarming, but they followed predictable patterns. They occurred in areas where the limestone was closest to the surface and where groundwater pumping was heaviest. The coast, with its thick layers of sand and proximity to unlimited ocean water, seemed relatively protected. That assumption has been shattered. Over the past 18 months, coastal sinkholes have increased by 400% compared to historical averages. The beaches of Pinellas County, Manatee County, and Sarasota County have experienced partial collapses that have forced the closure of public beach access points and caused millions in emergency response costs. In some locations, the beach has retreated more than 200 feet in a matter of hours, not from wave erosion but from subsidence, the ground literally dropping away into voids below. Marine geologists examining the phenomenon have discovered something deeply unsettling. The limestone beneath Florida's coastal areas has been compromised far more extensively than anyone realized. Using ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging, researchers have mapped vast networks of cavities and weakened zones running parallel to the shoreline. These aren't small voids. Some of the caverns detected are the size of commercial aircraft hangars, existing just 30 to 50 feet below popular beaches. The sand and sediment above these voids is held in place by a combination of compression and what geologists call bridging, where the strength of the overlying material spans the gap, like an arch. But this bridge is temporary. It's only a matter of time before additional stress causes it to fail. Several factors are accelerating this failure, and they're all intensifying simultaneously. First, there's development. Florida's population has exploded from roughly 2 million in 1950 to over 22 million today. Each new resident, each new building, each new golf course and shopping mall requires water. Groundwater extraction from the Floridan aquifer has increased exponentially, lowering the water table and removing the buoyant support that once helped keep the limestone stable. In some coastal areas, the aquifer has dropped more than 15 feet in just 3 decades. Second, there's saltwater intrusion. As fresh water is pumped from the aquifer faster than rain can replenish it, seawater infiltrates the porous limestone from below and from the sides. Unlike freshwater, which is relatively neutral, saltwater is chemically aggressive. The salt acts as a catalyst, accelerating the dissolution of limestone at rates up to 3 times faster than freshwater alone. This creates a feedback loop. More pumping leads to more saltwater intrusion, which dissolves the limestone faster, which weakens the ground, which creates more sinkholes. Third, there's the impact of climate change and sea level rise. As ocean levels creep higher, the pressure gradient between the sea and the aquifer changes. Saltwater pushes deeper and farther inland through the limestone matrix. Storm surge from increasingly powerful hurricanes drives massive volumes of saltwater into the ground, saturating the limestone with corrosive seawater that continues dissolving rock long after the storm has passed. Hurricane Idalia in 2023 pushed surge waters more than 12 feet above normal levels in some coastal areas. In the months following that storm, sinkhole reports in affected regions increased by 70%. The geology of Florida's coast makes it uniquely vulnerable to this combination of factors. What scientists call karst topography, landscape underlain by soluble rock like limestone, exists throughout the state. But it's most developed and most fragile in the coastal zones where the limestone has been exposed to seawater interaction for millennia. The Gulf Coast, with its low-lying terrain and extensive barrier islands, is particularly susceptible. These barrier islands, beloved destinations like Anna Maria Island, Sanibel, and the String of Keys, are essentially sand piles resting on limestone platforms. When the platform weakens, the entire island is at risk. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a hydrogeologist at the University of South Florida who has studied Florida's karst systems for 2 decades, puts it bluntly. We are witnessing the acceleration of a geological process that normally takes thousands of years. Human activity has compressed millennia of natural change into decades. The limestone is dissolving faster than it can be replaced by natural processes, and we're reaching critical thresholds in multiple locations simultaneously. It's not a question of whether more major collapses will occur, it's a question of when and where. The implications are staggering. Florida's coastal real estate is valued in the trillions of dollars. Beachfront property has been considered among the safest and most valuable investments in American real estate for generations. But how do you price a condominium built on ground that might literally disappear into a void? Insurance companies are already responding. Several major carriers have stopped writing new policies in Florida or have dramatically increased premiums for coastal properties. The reason cited is usually hurricane risk, but industry insiders acknowledge that sinkhole vulnerability is an equally serious concern that's nearly impossible to underwrite accurately. Local governments are scrambling to respond, but the scale of the problem far exceeds available resources. Traditional sinkhole remediation, filling the void with concrete or other stabilizing materials, works for small to medium sinkholes under buildings or roads. But when the void is the size of a city block and sits beneath a public beach, the cost becomes astronomical, and the engineering challenges multiply. You can't simply pour concrete under a beach without destroying the beach itself. Some communities are experimenting with deep injection of specialized grouts that can flow through the limestone and solidify in the voids, essentially gluing the rock back together. Early results are mixed, and the long-term effectiveness is unknown. Monitoring systems are being deployed along high-risk coastal areas. Networks of sensors can detect subtle ground movement that often precedes a collapse, potentially providing hours or even days of warning. But sensors are expensive, coverage is incomplete, and warnings don't prevent the collapse. They only allow evacuation. In some locations, authorities have erected signs warning beachgoers of sinkhole danger and advising them to watch for warning signs like circular depressions, tilting trees, or cracks in the sand. The guidance feels inadequate given the speed at which some collapses occur. The economic ripple effects are already visible. Tourism, Florida's largest industry worth over $100 billion annually, depends heavily on the state's beaches. Every beach closure, every dramatic video of sand vanishing into a sinkhole, every news report about geological instability chips away at the image of Florida as a safe, reliable vacation destination. Small businesses in beach communities report declining revenues. Real estate transactions are falling through when buyers become aware of sinkhole risks. Property values in some coastal areas have already begun to decline, a trend that could accelerate into a full-scale crisis if major collapses continue. There are environmental consequences as well. When beaches collapse, they can take with them crucial habitat for sea turtles, shorebirds, and other species. The sudden influx of sand and sediment into coastal waters can smother seagrass beds and coral formations. The mixing of fresh groundwater with salt water as sinkholes open can alter the salinity of nearshore environments, disrupting ecosystems that depend on specific conditions. Some biologists worry about the potential for sinkholes to create pathways for invasive species or pollutants to enter the aquifer system, contaminating the drinking water supply for millions. What can be done? The solutions being discussed range from ambitious to desperate. Some experts advocate for dramatic reductions in groundwater pumping, potentially requiring communities to shift to desalination plants for their water supply despite the enormous cost. Others propose massive engineering projects to artificially recharge the aquifer by capturing stormwater and injecting it deep underground, reversing the decline in water levels. There are calls for comprehensive geologic mapping of the entire coastline to identify the highest risk areas and potentially relocate development away from the most vulnerable zones. The most radical proposals suggest that parts of Florida's coast may need to be abandoned. Not immediately, not all at once, but through a managed retreat over decades as the geological reality becomes impossible to ignore or engineer around. This idea is politically toxic in a state whose identity and economy are built on coastal development, but some planners are quietly beginning to model what such a retreat might look like. For residents and visitors, the advice from geologists is to stay informed and stay alert. Learn the warning signs of sinkhole activity. Avoid areas where the ground shows signs of depression or unusual settling. If you own coastal property, consider geological surveys to assess what lies beneath your land. Support funding for monitoring and research. And perhaps most importantly, recognize that the ground beneath Florida's beaches is not as solid as it appears. The crisis unfolding beneath Florida's coast is a reminder that human civilization exists at the mercy of geological forces far more powerful than any engineering we can devise. We can manage these forces to some extent, adapt to them, work around them, but we cannot ignore them. The limestone platform that makes Florida possible is the same limestone platform that makes Florida vulnerable. For millions who call this state home, and millions more who visit each year, the beaches represent paradise, a meeting place of land and sea where memories are made and futures are built. But those beaches rest on a foundation that is quite literally dissolving away. The collapses will continue, the sinkholes will grow, the beaches will retreat. How Florida responds to this geological crisis will determine not just the fate of its coastline, but the future of a state that has always existed in defiance of the natural forces that shaped it. The ancient limestone is collapsing, and with it, assumptions about permanence, about progress, about humanity's ability to build forever on shifting sand and crumbling stone. What happens next in Florida may well be a preview of coastal challenges facing communities around the world as climate change, development pressure, and geological reality converge in ways we're only beginning to understand. The beach that disappeared that morning in Clearwater has not returned. The void remains, fenced off and monitored, a growing crater that serves as a stark reminder that the ground beneath our feet is not guaranteed, that nature's architecture operates on timescales and principles that care nothing for property lines or vacation schedules. Florida's coast is caving in, and the question facing millions is no longer whether this will continue, but how to live with the knowledge that paradise has always been built on the most fragile of foundations. The scientific community, watching Florida's coastal disintegration, sees patterns that extend far beyond state lines. What's happening along the Gulf Coast and Atlantic shores of Florida represents a canary in the coal mine for limestone-based coastlines globally. The Caribbean islands, the Yucatan Peninsula, parts of the Mediterranean coast, all share similar geological vulnerabilities. All face the same combination of rising seas, increased development pressure, and accelerating groundwater depletion. Florida is simply the first major population center where these forces have reached critical mass simultaneously. Recent studies using satellite imagery have revealed something even more disturbing than the visible collapses. The technology, which can detect ground subsidence measured in millimeters, shows that vast stretches of Florida's coastline are slowly sinking. Not from sinkholes, but from the gradual compaction of the limestone, as water is removed and the rock matrix compresses under its own weight. This subsidence is happening at rates of up to half an inch per year in some locations. That might not sound dramatic, but over a decade it adds up to 5 inches of elevation loss. When combined with sea level rise adding inches from above, the effect is multiplicative. Beaches are being squeezed from both directions, the ocean rising while the land sinks. The human stories emerging from affected communities paint a picture of uncertainty and loss that statistics cannot capture. In Manasota Key, a tight-knit beach community south of Sarasota, residents watched their public beach access point disappear into a sinkhole last summer. The collapse happened at 3 in the morning, preceded by sounds that witnesses described as distant thunder or a freight train. By dawn, the wooden walkway that generations of families had used to reach the beach had vanished into a crater filled with churning sand and seawater. The county has no timeline for repairs and no guarantee the ground is stable enough to rebuild. Real estate agent Marcus Chen, who has sold beachfront properties in Southwest Florida for 15 years, describes a market in transition. 3 years ago, buyers never asked about geological surveys or sinkhole history. Now it's the first question. Properties that once sold in days sit on the market for months. Some sellers are dropping prices 20, 30, even 40% just to find buyers willing to take the risk. The calculus has changed entirely. People are realizing that all the hurricane shutters and flood insurance in the world don't matter if the ground itself disappears. Emergency management officials face nightmare scenarios planning for events they have no historical precedent to guide them. How do you evacuate a beach when you don't know which section might collapse? How do you route emergency vehicles when sinkholes can open without warning on coastal roads? Some communities have begun implementing real-time monitoring centers where data from ground sensors, tide gauges, and aerial surveillance are analyzed around the clock. When anomalies appear, alerts go out to local authorities and potentially to the public. It's an imperfect system for an impossible problem. The federal government has been slow to recognize coastal sinkholes as a national issue worthy of major funding and research. FEMA includes sinkhole damage in its disaster declarations, but the agency's resources are stretched thin across multiple climate-related emergencies. The U.S. Geological Survey has expanded its monitoring of Florida's karst systems, but scientists say the effort remains dramatically underfunded relative to the scale of the threat. Congressional representatives from Florida have proposed legislation to create a national coastal geology monitoring program, but the bills have stalled in committee, lost among competing priorities and budget constraints. Meanwhile, the collapses accelerate. Each new sinkhole destabilizes surrounding areas, creating stress points that can trigger additional failures. Each major storm brings fresh pulses of corrosive saltwater into the limestone matrix. Each new development adds weight and demand for groundwater extraction. The system is not in equilibrium. It is in decline, moving toward outcomes that become more difficult and more expensive to manage with each passing year. Florida's coastline is being fundamentally reshaped, not over geological time, but over the span of human lifetimes, and the people living through this transformation are being forced to reckon with the reality that the paradise their parents knew may not exist for their children.